everyone, and welcome to Dead to Rights, the podcast, Season 2, Episode 59. I'm your host, Ted Carrick. This week, we'll be featuring an interview with author Barbara Van Driel, a former agent with the FBI. And Barbara will be speaking with us about her memoir, It Never Happened, in which she chronicles her 8-year career as a special agent in the FBI, exposing the dysfunctional culture of one of the country's most formidable bureaucracies. So that promises to be a really interesting interview, so stay with us for that. Before we get to it, I'd like to tell you about a book I've been reading this week, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, written by 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts who assess a president. And it is brought together by Bandy Lee, MD, who was the organizer of the Yale Duty to Warn conference. It's a fascinating book. I'll read to you from the back of it. There are those who still hold out hope that this president can be prevailed upon to listen to reason and curb his erratic behavior. Our professional experience would suggest otherwise. We collectively warn that anyone as mentally unstable as this man simply should not be entrusted with the life and death powers of the presidency. I can tell you it is both a fascinating and a terrifying read. I do encourage you to look it up. You know, if you're interested at all in psychology or in psychiatric assessments, it really is something that you should be familiar with. And it's a good read in terms of the layout as well. So that, again, is The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, and I highly recommend it. Not everyone will be interested in psychological analyses, but for those of us who are, it really is a worthwhile read. So now I'd like to bring you my interview with Barbara Van Driel. Please give her a big Dead to Rights welcome. So for our listeners, I'd like to welcome Barbara Van Driel, the author of It Never Happened, FBI Negligence and Duplicity Revealed from the Inside Out, which became available in paperback October 4th, 2018. Barbara, welcome to the show. It's good to have you.
Thank you, Donna. It's wonderful to be with you.
And what can you tell us about your book? I believe that you served as an agent from 1983 until, what was the year that you left?
I left in early May of 1991. So a little bit more than 8 years, about 8 years and 3 months.
Okay, so you had a pretty good exposure there.
Yes.
And where did you serve primarily?
Well, the Bureau policy at that time, I was recruited while I was at college in Kansas. So it's actually, Donna, about 10 years of my life, starting with the recruitment process at college. And then you go to Quantico, that's in Virginia, and after 16 weeks training, you returned at that time to your office of origin, where you entered the Bureau. For me, it was Kansas City. So it was a 6-month stint there. And then, you know, each director sets the transfer policy. So that's what it was back then.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's really interesting. Now, Barbara, what types, I'm trying to ask what department you would have been in. I'm not sure the right way to phrase that, but what was the primary focus of your investigative work?
Well, Donna, the way the Bureau decides where to assign agents is slightly random. So when I came out of Quantico and I was assigned in Kansas City, Missouri, I started on a criminal squad. And that was for a 2-month period where I did some training. And when you read my book, you'll see that the training agent, I affectionately refer to him as the sheriff. So there's a little description of him in the book. He was quite misogynistic, criticized me a lot. And we came to the agreement that I would be better off on a different squad. So I went on my second squad there and I did background investigations. That's people working different departments within the federal government, including the White House, and people who wanted to be FBI agents. And there I was very successful because I had a wonderful supervisor who was very pro-women. But when you bump into these agents, as really my book is filled with, and or supervisors who did not want to work with women, it could be trouble. for
Yeah, and
sure.
that was still really, I'm old enough to know that in the 80s, that was still a real serious problem. I mean, it still is. I'm not aware of it ever having been really resolved. But I think that people are a little more aware of the problem now
Hmm.
and
Well,
try to
oh, go ahead.
counter it to a greater degree, I think.
Right. Well, one of the problems was Mr. Hoover did not want women as agents. And by the way, that's another conversation. And frankly, I understood, even being a woman, why that was a problem. It was a problem on several levels. I don't really address that in the book, but that's another conversation. How they implemented, how they brought women into the Bureau at the time. The men I worked with, they all had come into the Bureau under Hoover. These men would be between, say, 45 and 55. So they had been in the Bureau 20 years plus. And
Hmm.
that culture had been established for decades. And they liked their good old boy system, frankly.
Sure, sure they
And,
did.
and a girl coming on the squad, it somehow just disturbed the balance of power for them. Yeah.
And well, yes, the balance of power is a good way to describe most of these situations, because they do have a lot to do with balance of power. But we're digressing a little bit. The Cold War was in full force when you first joined the FBI. So tell us a little bit
Mhm.
about how that colored your work too.
Well, interestingly, uh, handling counterintelligence, frankly, I feel has always been a problem for the Bureau. We're sort of seeing with these recent events with Mr. Strzok how there's a form of unaccountability, if you will. That's a little bit complicated in this discussion to describe. I do address that in the book. But I knew early on, Donna, that I wanted to go into counterintelligence. I didn't desire to be in the criminal world for a variety of reasons. Uh, but it seemed to me that doing counterintelligence would be a little bit more of an academic world. Certainly would not be rough and tumble.
Hmm.
It would be more nuanced. So
Hmm.
because I took the test and I did well in the foreign language aptitude, I quickly let people know that I would be open to studying a foreign language. And my book details how I was approached in my second office and told, the president literally would send out these requests via the Department of Justice. It's time for us to have more work done in that area. So
Hmm.
frankly, I worked primarily in the counterintelligence area my entire career once I elected to go to foreign language school.
That is fascinating. And what
Yeah.
languages did you master?
I decided I had the choice of studying Chinese, Korean, Arabic, or Russian. And for a variety of reasons, I chose Russian. And I think it was a good choice. I still go to Russia. I was able to go to Russia after I left the Bureau in the 90s, had nothing to do
Mhm.
with my career. And then recently, the last 2, 3 years, I've been traveling back there again. So I love it. I still do very well in the language.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. I
I, I,
really,
mm.
yeah, I
I
admire people
devoted
who take in
myself. It
languages.
was
Yeah.
the toughest thing I've ever done academically. It was a very intense program. It wasn't like college. It was a complete 8 hours a day plus 5, 6 hours a night of homework for
Hmm.
quite a long
Hmm.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be because Russian is quite different. It doesn't necessarily follow all of the same rules as the Western languages.
Hmm.
I know I tried to study Chinese Mandarin with my
Oh
children
boy.
for a number of years, and it was it was an exercise in humility because I'd always considered myself kind of good at picking up languages. But any language that really does not conform to the same rule structure as your mother tongue, if you haven't learned it when you're very young, I think the obstacles are great and not insurmountable because I've got so many Chinese friends who have learned English. So obviously it can be done, you know.
Yes, I unfortunately or fortunately, I was 30 when I started, and I literally, Donna, got there. I didn't even know the alphabet. Uh,
Hmm.
so I didn't realize how difficult it would be. I had never encountered anything like that. But my nature is to be all in. And I
Hmm.
really devoted myself to my studies, realizing that if I didn't do really well, I would never be able to use the language.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I did well. And so I'm happy. That's something that was a great gift to me that all these years later I still can use.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
absolutely. And it
really,
can't
really
be taken
wonderful.
away. And
Yeah.
30 is still within that young enough. I know that the psychologists argue this, but truthfully, I found in my 30s I was still quite receptive to things. When I was trying to study Mandarin with my kids, though, I was already in my 40s, and it was getting difficult, it was getting difficult. We did cover a lot of ground. My son studied for 8 years, and my daughter
Wow.
studied for about six, and
Did they
then
end up
she.
using the language? Did they get to go to China and things like that?
No, he's 20. He's still in university, and she's
Oh, okay.
16. She's still in high school.
Oh,
But she is from China, so one day she will probably want to go back. But she had a lot less interest in it than our son did.
hmm.
So she was the one that rebelled and said, "Enough of this. We don't want to do this anymore."
Well, the thing that I found interesting, again, a little bit off the topic, but not really, uh, we're women and we like to talk about how you get more intelligent, right? More competent, more professional. Studying a foreign language is like studying music, and there's been a
Hmm.
lot of research done, and I can tell you, it changed my brain. I
Yes.
mean, I have been able, even to this day, to learn anything, to study anything I want to. It's quite
Hmm.
amazing. It
Hmm.
rewired my brain. Um,
Yes.
and I can memorize things still.
Hmm.
I still study the language a little bit. I'm getting ready to go back. I'm actually going for 2 weeks to Chechnya, which is
Hmm.
the area I've been going to in the last couple of years. And so I get ready for it, but I just dive right in. And boy, it's just like you and I speaking right now.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
wonderful. It's a
Yeah.
wonderful feeling mentally.
There's a muscle memory in the brain, but there is more than that. There's the ability to assimilate information, which, if you're a lifelong student of anything, your brain learns how to assimilate
Hmm.
information. And it doesn't ever really forget that, barring any disease,
Right.
barring any of the natural things that can get in our way. But
Right.
as long as we remain healthy, we remain capable of assimilating
Right.
information. So,
Yeah, isn't that a great joy? I mean, that's one of the things I really love about life. I love learning
yes,
and
yes.
keeping my brain fertile, keeping my health good.
It's so
And
good to
I
hear you
think also,
say
that
that.
was part of my personality, which so suited me to the bureau, which made it rather, I mean, a tragedy. I mean, if as you read the book, you realize the disappointments I'm encountering because I was brought up. I came from a family that I was encouraged to do well, and I really resonated with fidelity, bravery, integrity, and wanting
Hmm.
to do well. And I found that this bureaucracy, even going back to the 80s, was already very compromised in that sense. It
Hmm.
did not encourage hard work. It encouraged the sort of, play the game, Barb. And
Hmm.
that's really ultimately when people ask me, you can see the different events that happened. But ultimately, I said, do I really want to make this effort constantly pushing when the hard work I do is really not appreciated? It
Hmm.
really wasn't. Very discouraged, actually.
Do you think that's symptomatic of almost any bureaucracy, in particular government bureaucracies?
I absolutely do. And how
Yes.
naive I was. I've often, people have said to me, of course, Donna, you were so naive. And I said, well, you could say that on one hand, but I met that recruiter. I was still 25 years old. I spent a lot of time in the process of being recruited in the Bureau. I think that someone should have said a little something to me about the nature of the organization. Uh, you don't let someone just walk in and think, oh, it's like, Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., and we all work hard and ooh rah rah.
Hmm.
Uh,
And
so,
besides which, who goes into law enforcement, really, Barbara? I mean, because to my mind, people who go into law enforcement, no matter what they come out the other end as, they go in with a desire for justice and truth and all the good, noble things. I
mm,
think most do. Some
right.
go in, of
Mhm.
course, in some levels of law enforcement simply because their families were in law enforcement or they feel they don't have any other skills. But I think the vast majority would go in with some sense of nobility, which, yes, we can
Mhm.
now call it naivete.
It's naivete, yes, but yeah, and I wasn't going to have that removed from me because, frankly, I never had a bad day working with the public. I enjoyed everything I did. I'm not the
Hmm.
kind of person who gets bored or thinks things are trivial. I can, if you study the foreign language like I did and like you did, you understand why children do so well in certain things. They love repetition. They don't
Mm-hmm.
tire of it. And
Mm-hmm.
I studied a lot of music. I study classical piano. That's a lot of repetition. And to
Yes.
be a good agent, you really have to be willing to kind of quote unquote lower yourself to that level of I have to be super attentive to all the little details. Cases are redundant,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the counterintelligence world. You know, what are we doing? We're throwing out a gigantic net through these little
Mm-hmm.
cases in the event that we find someone who is committing espionage in our country, from
Mm-hmm.
another country. And that's dreary, quote unquote, work unless you
Mm-hmm.
understand the big picture and that you truly enjoy that minutia.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of the problem in recruiting people, especially for the counterintelligence world.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Now, I talk to a lot of writers, in particular crime writers, because crime is my genre, and it sounds like you're describing shoe leather. I mean, just old-fashioned kind of
Right,
shoe leather.
right.
Do you think that's a good description for it?
That's cute. Yes, it is. And, when I first got on my squad in Houston, this is kind of funny, Donna, because I didn't know anything about how cases were run in counterintelligence. I'd had a few months there, 6 months in Kansas City with the sensitive background investigations in some of those criminal cases. But getting on counterintelligence was its own world. And this is where I began to really see the laziness of agents. Just
Hmm.
because of the way they opened the cases, the agents were, well, this doesn't amount to anything. I said, really? I think it does. I think it amounts to the security of our country. So I right away was in a philosophical clash with these
Hmm.
senior agents. And as you read the book, you see these things, you sort of laugh. But boy, uh, I really wasn't laughing at the time. I was
No.
sort of alarmed. And, as you have, I'm sure you understand also, one individual doesn't change the culture. You either join the culture or you're up against it all the time.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, you've hit on something very real, and it's a real lesson throughout life. And my husband and I often have thought, because we're getting a little older now, we're getting closer to retirement. We live in Canada. And if we had gone into public service of any kind, if we'd gone into government work, which either of us could have done,
Hmm.
we'd be retiring with pretty substantial pensions and things like that. But neither one of us would have been able to tolerate the bureaucracy. And we
Hmm.
know that about ourselves. I mean, someone very close to me worked for a very short time in a government agency. And just to give a quick, sort of something that people will understand, but it doesn't really mean anything. She was told early on, we need this report immediately. It has to be done by tomorrow. So she stayed up all night preparing this report, put it in her boss's tray where it sat for 6 months unopened.
The Bureau has all
So
these
she,
phrases, and one of them you're making me think of a job put off is a job half done.
Mhm.
So often they would say that, oh, it's got to be. And then the next day come or 2 days later, and everyone's looking the other way. Well,
Yeah,
you didn't need to do that. Maybe it'll never come up again at all.
yeah,
So
yeah.
there,
Well, she
that's
knew,
Canadian
like I
bureaucracy.
know, that government work was not for her. And I really don't think I could have survived the kinds of trials that you're talking about in your book, the bureaucracy and the, wanting to do things and being faced with obstacles.
Hmm. Yes. And the other thing is they make you take an oath, and I think that's good. You take an oath. It's a profession. It's really more than having a job. And you
Mhm.
understand that when you take your oath, you're obligated for 3 years. If
Mhm.
you don't serve 3 years, they give you a black mark. You
Mhm.
leave the bureau with, oh, you didn't fulfill your initial obligation.
Sure.
Then, if I can say, they seduced me early on with studying the foreign language. I was
Mhm.
supposed to be in the bureau 3 years until I was allowed to study a foreign language, but President Reagan sent out the word, obviously, went to the DOJ, we need people to study Russian,
Mhm.
anyone who's capable. So my supervisor said, hey, Barb, You can go in January. This was October. And I
Mhm.
said, but I've only been an agent a little bit, what, a year and a half? Oh, that's okay. They're going to waive that requirement.
Mhm.
Problem was, Donna, again, I was signing up for another 4 years.
Y-
That was my
Yeah.
obligation, and
Yeah.
not only financially, but morally. The American citizens paid for me to go to school.
Mhm.
I didn't have to work. So, these things play on your conscience. So each time I made a further commitment, I said to myself, I have to fulfill this. That was my own personal ethic. I really
Yeah.
do. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And you do. And you do. I mean, when you make these commitments in life, you do need to. Now, just to get down to the nitty-gritty about the
Hmm.
book,
Yes.
you've talked about the culture of negligence, duplicity, and abuse. What kind of feedback have you had from your former colleagues about your book?
Well, interestingly, anyone that's I've addressed in the book, I haven't heard from. The people don't know how to be in touch with me. But I'll tell you an interesting thing. I won't mention any names. First of all, you can see in the book, I had to use all pseudonyms except for
Mm-hmm.
mine and Hanson.
Mm-hmm.
Um, through a series of events in the last couple of years, I've been able to be acquainted with an agent who retired, took his full pension, and I got the nerve in the fall to say, "Oh, would you be willing to read my manuscript and consider an endorsement?" Oh, the person was super enthusiastic. So
Mm-hmm.
read the book and sent an electronic copy, of course. And Donna, I don't hear anything for a day or two.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not stupid, but I said, okay, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. So I finally sent a text message and said so. Oh, I get this big, long text. Well, I feel for you, and if there's any justice in the world, your voice will get out there, your story will be there. But I can't give you an endorsement. That's going to be money out of my pocket. This person is a talking head, gets on different programs. That's why I don't want to mention who it is.
Mm-hmm.
And said, no, I would not give you an endorsement because it's my bread and butter. Carrying the water for the Bureau and knowing what he's saying is not truthful.
Mm-hmm.
So isn't that interesting? The Bureau hasn't changed, and we've had conversations. And the stories I wouldn't even tell you the stories he's told me. I would be embarrassed to say them on air. They're
Mm-hmm.
they're very raw.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that the culture hasn't changed. There are
Mm-hmm.
more women and minorities now, making the grade and getting ahead and going into management and things. But the culture is even more declined. It sounds
It's
pretty ugly.
it's difficult to change the roots of something that is really
Mhm.
firmly rooted, and
Right.
doesn't mean that we shouldn't try.
I think
Which
they
comes
need a
back to
radical.
what you're talking.
Yeah.
Yeah, they need a radical upheaval, but at the same time, even slow working can help. Even bringing in the diversity, more women in management, more people of color in management, all of that can help.
Mhm.
But it's really difficult when something is firmly rooted. And as you say, a lot of it came out of the Hoover generation, which
Right.
for
Yeah.
anybody in our age bracket knows how manipulative that whole era
Right. And
was,
the other thing
into the
was
future.
Hoover demanded perfection. And you and I know that there are mistakes that will always be made in all aspects of life. And so the Bureau's attitude was we don't address anything that's a boo-boo because we can't allow for it. So that sets
Yeah,
up when you're not allowed to fail. In my childhood, I was allowed to fail.
you
I
have to
wasn't
be.
criticized because I didn't do well. My father would say, "Well, Bobby," he called me Bobby. Let's talk about how you felt about that, why you weren't applying yourself. And he was a good psychologist and did
Hmm.
it with firmness, but very lovingly. That's not the Bureau culture. They have to hide things that are
Hmm.
boo-boos. How did Bob Hansen, that's something I write about a little bit. How did he get through a career of 20 something years spying for the Soviets and not get discovered?
Yeah.
And when this all came out after I had left the Bureau, was I shocked? Not as shocked as you think I should be, because I saw the way he ran our squad there in New York City. And not that I thought he was spying, but I knew that he had all kinds of security infractions he was allowing, even promoting. And if you questioned it, oh boy. I mean,
Oh,
gun to your head.
oh,
Don't
yeah.
question anything. We
Yeah.
got a good gig going on here, Barb, and we don't need anybody
Yeah.
to interfere with it. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is maybe that defines for our listeners what I was saying earlier about my husband and I making the choice to stay in private industry. And because private industry, you've got has an unwritten mantra that if you're not making mistakes, you're not doing anything.
Right.
You
Right.
can't be productive without mistakes, and finger pointing is pointless unless it's designed to correct the initial mistake, because only correcting the mistake moves you forward.
Right.
I mean, how do you correct something that you aren't willing to uncover?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
There was a lot of, there's a lot of history with the Bureau. So you get in and you sit around. I mean, I quickly stopped sitting around having coffee with senior agents because it was like a gab fest complain situation. Everybody complaining about the things that they were unhappy about. Frankly, Donna, this was just all laziness, contributing to the negligence, as opposed to let's be positive. Let's do things to push forward the quality of our work and not be a part of the system.
Yeah.
It's just one person at a time who elects to say, I won't play that game.
Yeah.
But that bureaucracy was so strong, and the encouragement to just go along and underperform, just realize how you can get in here, you get your pay grades automatically. By the way, as far as performance ratings, a supervisor, this is again part of the culture. If he were to give an agent a less than what they call satisfactory performance rating, that reflects on him and his ability to go up in the system. Now, how smart is that? That's not a good way to set up the system. So our bell curve was shifted over. So an FD student, quote unquote, was actually getting a B. You see, you can't get a bad grade. And so people like myself, and there were other, were getting A pluses. Not that we weren't A students, but if you shift that bell curve, it's not really legitimate when they give you the exceptional rating, right?
Yeah.
Because who's on the other end?
Yeah.
The people who don't work are getting what they call fully satisfactory.
Yeah.
And and of course you don't want to be like a crybaby paying attention to other people, but pretty soon you'll see in the book the supervisor saying, hey Barb, can you help me out with these cases? I can't get Joe Schmo to work. And you go, hey boss, do something about it. No, we got to work around the people who don't want to work. Why? Well, that plays into what will happen to him as a supervisor on his career path.
Wow.
It was just the system, and it was really heavy, as I said, in the counterintelligence. Counterintelligence, you don't go to trial. It's not those kind of cases. It's really under the radar, which is why I've written a little bit about this on my website, things that I posted since the book was published. Maybe considering a domestic counterintelligence organization of people who really want to do that with a foreign language requirement, a very different kind of background, and take it out of the Bureau, which, back 100 years ago, the Bureau wasn't about counterintelligence. The Congress added these statutes as time went by. So it wasn't the focus of the Bureau early on to be involved in this world. And so it was never mentioned to me, Donna, that there was the possibility of working that kind of work when I was being recruited. You're thinking it's guns and badges and run out there and, like you say, shoe leather, gumshoe type of work, not the subtlety.
Ephraim Simulus Jr. Yeah.
Right. What we all think of the standard, but there's a whole world that the Bureau had to manage. And frankly, they did it very poorly, in my opinion, and from my experience.
And for our listeners, you mentioned your website. It's www.barbaravandriel, DRIEL.com. And the book is titled It Never Happened. So look for that at major retailers. FBI Negligence and Duplicity Revealed by Barbara Van Driel. From the Inside Out, which is just an excellent title. And the cover is just stunning, Barbara. Thank you very much.
That? Did you like the way I chose a redacted concept?
I
the black
did.
And the red. Yeah.
I did. And I have to tell you, red's my favorite color anyway. So no, it's a
Thank you so much.
Gorgeous cover. It's very attractive. I really encourage people to go and look for it.
It's
It Never
also
Happened by
available.
Barbara Van.
It's available, of course, at Amazon, which is
Yes.
probably what everyone loves to shop these days, right? Easy.
Yes, exactly. Easy peasy. And there it is in Kindle or paperback. So it's a very easy buy and it looks like a great read. I really recommend it. Thank you very much for joining us, Barbara. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much, Donna. It's my pleasure.
It's great to have a professional law enforcement person on the line with us because so many of our listeners and interviewees are crime writers. So that's kind of really fascinating. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, Donna.
Let it rot.
I'd like to thank Barbara Van Driel for joining us today on the Dead to Rights podcast. Are you a published crime writer, either true crime or fiction? Would you like to be interviewed on Dead to Rights? If so, please contact me at carrickpublishing@rogers.com, and in the subject line, please say Dead to Rights interview, and I'd love to hook up with you. You can always contact either myself, Donna Carrick, or my husband, Alec Carrick, on Facebook, on Twitter, or through the carrickpublishing@rogers.com email address. On Facebook, we're known as Donna Carrick, Alex Carrick with an X, or Carrick Publishing, or Dead to Rights. On Twitter, my handle is @Donna_Carrick. You can also reach @Alex_Carrick, @Dead to Rights Pod, or @Carrick Pub. All music featured on Dead to Rights, the podcast, has been composed and performed by Ted Carrick. And you can find out more about Ted's music at his YouTube channel, Ted Carrick Music. Be sure to join us next week when we bring you our interview with Howard Levine, author of Last Gasp. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.
A dusty road, a man alone. His vital signs go on hold. And I don't know what you've been told, but the years have turned my eyes gold. And I told you what you told me, we'd never be in the same boat for free. Yet it rots. Let it rot.